This is the third lecture for week 4, continuing the theme of attachment and relationships and looking at the parent-child relationship. Your reading talks about several other types of relationships, important relationships with siblings and peers and romantic partners, and we're not going to talk about those relationships this week, but we will talk about other important relationships in future weeks. This third lecture mostly looks at parenting styles, which are described in your reading for this week, and also what the underlying dynamics are in terms of parenting styles and what outcomes have been correlated or associated with different parenting styles. So parenting styles are a broad pattern of parenting. Just like with attachment styles, people aren't necessarily always going to act in one particular way that follows neatly into a particular category, but if you look across people's behaviors, they tend to fall into one of these types of categories that I'll describe. And the categories are 4 main types of parenting styles that are described in your reading and that have had enduring influence. They were first identified by Diana Baumrind, and then others have added to them over time. And really the central idea with parenting styles is that it's about control. It's about parental control. How firmly is the parent exerting control, and who has the control? Is it the parent or is it the child? So you'll see more about that as I describe the different parenting styles. So for each of these parenting styles, I'm going to show you an image to try to help you remember the type of parenting style. And this authoritarian parent is the kind of the drill sergeant. So this parent would tell you something to do something and they would just say, do it. That's because the authoritarian parent in their style of parenting imposes a lot of rules and expects strict obedience, but doesn't necessarily, rarely explains why you're meant to do something, and often relies on power tactics like punishment and the kind of control that adults have over children's lives, like taking things away, to require strict obedience. And so there's a lot of control being exerted here, and very sort of firm control by this authoritarian parent. The permissive parent, on the other hand, would be more like a cream puff, so very soft and indulgent, and with relatively few rules and demands for the child, in letting the child express his or herself and her own impulses, not putting a lot of control on the child. So where the authoritarian parent is exerting a lot of control, the control is off in terms of the permissive parent. So that's the kind of parent who would say, do you want to do it? And really putting the control onto the child to decide. The authoritarian parent is, balancing, like you can see the rocks here, is much more in between the strict control of the authoritarian parent and the soft sort of lack of control, but the warmth, the gooiness of the permissive parent. This is the parent who says, do it because. So they've got rules, the parent is loving and firm, but they explain and they give a rationale for why the child is meant to adhere to a certain standard or follow a certain rule. And the parent, this authoritative parent, is responsive to the child's needs and to the child's point of view. So that's the authoritative parent. And you can hear I just confused it. Often it gets confused because it sounds like authoritarian, but authoritative is the parent that combines kind of reasoning and flexibility with still a firm set of expectations for the child. And then the 4th type of parent is the uninvolved parent or the neglectful parent. It can just be described in both ways. And here I've got a slug because there's not a lot of energy going into this kind of parenting. This is the parent they're basically giving the message, do what you want. So there's not a lot of control being exerted on towards the child. And there's not a lot of concern either. So the parent may act rejecting or may just be withdrawn and not really responding to the child, may be overwhelmed with the parent, may be overwhelmed with his or her own needs. So there are some underlying dynamics going on with these 4 types of parenting styles. There's one dynamic related to parental acceptance or responsiveness, or it's also called parental warmth. So how accepting, how responsive is the parent to the child? So authoritative parenting and permissive parenting are high on parental acceptance. They tend to be accepting and warm and loving towards the child, where it's authoritarian parenting and neglectful or uninvolved parenting tends to be sort of low in terms of responsiveness and warmth and acceptance of the child. And then there's parental demandingness, which is how much control is being exerted over the child. And authoritative parenting and authoritarian parenting tend to be high in terms of the amount of control being exerted on the child, how much is being demanded of the child. Whereas permissive parenting or uninvolved and neglectful parenting, the demands put on the child are low. So you remember back to week 2 when we talked about correlations. So, because we can't have an experimental type of research study where we remove children from one type of parent and see what they're like if they were, parented by a different parent, we can't separate out things like genes and environment and parenting. So we can't say for sure, what causes certain kinds of outcomes. But there have been a lot of research over time that's looked at correlations. Again, that's observational studies that can produce correlations to see what kinds of outcomes seem to be associated with different types of parenting styles. And it seems that, research has suggested, many studies over time, because that's what you need to suggest that a correlation might have good evidence behind it, is that authoritative parenting is associated with children overall doing the best in terms of these 4 outcomes. That children tend to do well all around, both socially with their peers and also do well academically. Permissive parents, on the other hand, children tend to do well in terms of their self-esteem and in terms of their social skills, but they tend to not do so well in terms of academics, and they tend to have more problem behavior. So again, we can think about this. These are children who are getting a lot of positive messages about their value. They're getting a lot of warmth and responsiveness, but they're not getting a lot of controls. And so, not surprisingly, we don't see that they're being kept necessarily to some strict standards for academics or behavior. So they tend to sort of misbehave more because they're not being kept in line, but they feel good about themselves overall. That's what research suggests. Authoritarian parenting. So authoritarian parents, that's the drill sergeant parents. Children of authoritarian parents, correlations suggest, tend to do well in school, but and have few problem behaviors, but have poorer social skills and lower self-esteem and higher rates of depression than authoritative and permissive parents' children. And why is this? So they're getting a lot of control exerted on them. So you can see that their behavior in school and socially, tends to be kind of kept in line, but they're not getting that warmth, that sensitivity from a caregiver. And so there's, it seems to be some kind of relation there in terms of having low responsiveness and more issues related to self-esteem and social skills and depression. And then the 4th type of parenting, the uninvolved, neglectful parenting, not surprisingly, these are parents that are not involved or have their own issues or even are rejecting to their children. And these children perform most poorly on all domains, so they're more likely to have mental health issues and also not do well in school. So because this research is correlational, we have to ask the question, what is the causal relationship here? And we could ask the question, is it the parent's behavior, the parenting style is influencing the child? So authoritative parents produce more self-reliant, more socially competent children? Or is it that children who have a tendency towards being more socially competent and academically competent will elicit that kind of response, that kind of authoritative parenting? So do they elicit those kinds of reactions from parents? Or is it there's some kind of third factor that's related to both authoritative parenting and having a self-reliant child that's really responsible for that link? Is it having a high income or having high education or having a lot of resources, or is it being raised within the context of a harmonious marriage? So because this is correlational research, we can't say for sure that it is the parenting style that's producing these outcomes in children. And this relates to your reading that talks about the model of effects in terms of children. Is it parent-child transmission? Is it child-parent transmission? Or is it transactional? So your reading talks about models of influence in the family and what's responsible for children's outcomes, developmental outcomes. Is it that influences go straight from the parent to the child? So the parent is sort of influencing the outcomes in the child. Or is it also that the child is influencing how they are parented? So certain children get certain responses from parents. Or is it that parent and children influence each other over time, and patterns develop over time, and problems also escalate over time? So it's very likely to be this kind of transactional type of model. So just to point out, it's not as simple as saying, parents decide to be a parent of a certain kind and they make their children a certain way. It's more complex than that because children are influencing the kind of interactions they receive as well. Now, to connect this discussion back to our earlier discussion about attachment, responsiveness, that idea of responsiveness or warmth seems to be a link between parenting style and attachment type. So responsiveness is related to whether, how the child develops a particular attachment type and whether they develop that feeling of trust. And it also develops their internal working model and their perception of self and other. And so, we can expect and hypothesize that authoritative parenting would be more likely to be associated, for example, with secure parenting, secure attachment, whereas the other types, permissive parenting, there's a lot of warmth there and responsiveness, so there may also be a secure attachment there. With authoritarian parenting, you might see an insecure attachment type. And of course, the uninvolved or neglectful parent, is also likely to be associated with an insecure attachment type. And now to also make a connection with week 3. So why is it that authoritative parenting may be the most beneficial if we think it's the parenting that is responsible for a lot of the outcomes we see? And it can be, we can hypothesize that it may be that authoritative parenting is exerting an influence on children through the types of socialization that's used. So an authoritative parent is modeling emotional regulation, so they're showing their own emotional regulation and emotional understanding and social understanding by being responsive and sensitive to the child. And there's a combination of responsiveness and control, reasonable control, which is likely to be effective in terms of reinforcing positive behaviors. So there's a reasonable kind of punishments and rewards that would be likely to go into supporting positive behaviors. And because authoritative parents are explaining their reasoning often, they can provide instruction, which is the cognitive method of socialization, that can fit with their child's ability to take responsibility for their own behavior. So it's likely that authoritative parents may be using different socialization methods that may be supporting positive outcomes in their children. And on a closing note, I just want to make a comment, though, that it's not that parents need to be perfect to produce children who develop well, and can, live in the world. So hopefully these lectures haven't suggested that people need to be some kind of a perfect paragon on parenting to produce children and later adults who will have positive development. There's actually this idea of good enough parenting that came from Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, the child psychologist, and he talked about the idea that basically parents need to know that being loving and providing attention to the infant, so having that sensitivity, that the parent needed to be as good as they could. They could only needed to provide as much as that person was able to provide. So good enough parenting. The standard is not perfect. It's as good as you can in terms of being as loving and sensitive as you can to the child. And again, children have a resilience where they can often, do well, even when they're faced with challenges. But it's not that people need to be perfect, but in general, if parents are trying, if the parents are trying to be sensitive and loving to their children, it's very likely that they're the quote-unquote good enough parent that can support their child's needs. So that concludes our lectures for week 4 on attachments and relationships, and focusing on specifically on the parent-child relationship, but then how that relationship then we'll see in future weeks how that relates and influences peer relationships and other types of relationships.